Hello again, and thank you for joining me for part 2 of the Des Nilsen case. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, be sure to go back and watch it. I'll put a little clicky card up here or here. I never know where they go, so you can click and go to part 1 if you haven't seen that yet. If you did see it, you will remember that we were just finishing up talking about Des Nilsen, his personality, his history, and his very first murder. We also talked a little bit about how homophobia played a huge role in how Dennis got away with his crimes for so long, which was really very similar to another serial killer from the US, a guy named Jeffrey Dahmer, who you've probably heard of. The MOs of these two killers was very similar. They had a very similar victim pool. And so because of that, Des Nilsen is often called the Jeffrey Dahmer of London or the Jeffrey Dahmer of the UK. In part 2 here, we're going to continue on talking about his victims and, of course, his apprehension and trial. I'm going to stick a disclaimer up here, and I'll see you in a second. So I said that Des Nilsen took his first victim in December of 1978, a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes, and that then it would be about a year before he would kill again. So in December of 79, he met a Canadian tourist named Kenneth Oakenden, and I hope I've got that name very correct. He met Kenneth in a pub, as he did so many other men. They went sightseeing together, and then Kenneth came back to his apartment for a little nightcap and a little sleepover. Unfortunately, Kenneth would never leave that apartment because Dennis strangled him with the cord from his headphones. Kenneth would end up being one of Nilsen's only victims that actually had a missing persons report filed for him. As I said before, Nilsen chose most of his victims from a pool of people sort of on the outskirts of society: sex workers, runaways, homeless people, drifters. And so nobody ever really came looking for them. But Kenneth was in fact missed. After Kenneth was murdered, Nilsen posed him in sort of provocative poses and took pictures of him, always with the camera. He also put Kenneth's body in an armchair in the living room and watched TV with him, and they snuggled a little bit. He used Kenneth's body like an inanimate roommate for a while, until eventually, as all organic things do, he started to decay a little bit, and Dennis just casually slid him under the floorboards, just like he had with Stephen. Then on May 17th of 1980, Dennis picked up a 16-year-old homeless teenager named Martin Duffy. He drowned Duffy in the kitchen sink and then laid next to his body, kissed him, and cuddled him, and then again put him under the floorboards. William Sutherland was only 26 years old when he unfortunately crossed paths with Des Nilsen. He had been working as a sex worker, and he met Dennis at a local pub. He ended up following Dennis back to his little house of horrors, where he was subsequently strangled to death. And you guessed it, put under the floorboards. In September of 1981, Dennis happened across 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, who was sort of slumped over against a wall near Dennis's apartment. Dennis sensed that this guy was in some kind of distress. He actually was an epileptic, and he had had a seizure, passed out near the building. Dennis actually called an ambulance for this guy and waited with him until help arrived, just as any good Samaritan would. After being treated at the hospital and released, Malcolm returned to Dennis's apartment just to thank him for, helping him out in his time of need and getting him some medical attention, possibly even saving his life. And in return, Des Nilsen strangled him to death and stuffed him under the kitchen sink. I guess he was out of room under the floorboards. Dennis won't be getting that citizenship award after all. Besides these men I just mentioned, Dennis had 5 other victims, at least, who remain unidentified. And throughout Dennis's little spree, the bodies just were kind of piling up under the floorboards, under the sink, and inside wardrobes. Some were there as long as a year before he finally disposed of them. And the disposal is where we will recall back to the private yard available to Dennis from his apartment that was nicely fenced in. He would make large bonfires and carry the dismembered remains out in bags to burn them to ash. He also piled tires on top of the fire because he wanted to cover up the smell. Burning human flesh definitely has a distinct odor, but apparently the odor from the burning tires was somehow worse or at least stronger because nobody seemed to catch on. In 1982, Dennis's landlord announced that he was finally going to be doing extensive renovations on this crappy old building, and unfortunately for Dennis, that meant that he had to move. When this announcement came, he still had some bodies lying around, just, completely normal stuff. Gotta clean behind the stove, gotta get the bodies out from under the floorboards. So he made one last big farewell bonfire and cleaned up so well that whatever builders came in to renovate the place never suspected anything. And at this point, he moves to the Cranley Gardens address in Muswell Hill, North London. And this is where he gets his other moniker, the Muswell Hill Murderer. It's not a very interesting one, so I guess I sort of omitted it, but some people do call him the Muswell Hill Murderer. This was an attic apartment. It had no floorboards to pry up. It had no private yard to burn bodies in. And apparently, Nilsen actually had the hope that having this apartment where it was not convenient to dispose of any remains would kind of make him stop killing people. But this little plan didn't work out very well. As it turns out, murderous impulses do not care if you have a place to hide the body. So in March of 1982, Dennis killed 23-year-old John Howlett by drowning him in the bathtub after 3 unsuccessful attempts to strangle him. And that September, 27-year-old Graham Allen would fall prey to Nilsen's proclivities. Nilsen left his body in the bathtub for 3 days before finally dissecting him on the kitchen floor. At the end of January 1983, Nilsen met 20-year-old heroin addict Stephen Sinclair. He just met him out on the street. He bought him a hamburger and invited him to come back to his place for some drinks. Once they were back at his place, Dennis strangled him too, just like he had so many others. Dennis has a real problem, which is that, of course, as we discussed, he has no place to dispose of the bodies. What's a guy to do? Well, remember how he spent 11 years in the military as a butcher? He put his meat cutting skills to good use, dissecting all 3 men into smaller pieces and storing the remains in trash bags, which he then hid under the kitchen sink and in his wardrobe. He started boiling some of the pieces in order to disintegrate them, and also started kind of flaying chunks of flesh to make them smaller. And then he took these partially disintegrated and cut up little small bits, and he began flushing them down the toilet. And now we have come full circle to the beginning of our story, with the Dino Rod Man finding the decayed bits of human flesh in the drains outside of 23 Cranley Gardens. Obviously, we have already covered the part where he's apprehended by the police, and he confesses to having killed 15 or 16 people he can't quite remember. But obviously, since he has made this claim, they need to question him in order to find out who these victims are and where they are. Because, of course, they only have the remains of the 3 people that were killed at Cranley Gardens. They don't know anything about Melrose Avenue. But as it were, this is basically exactly what he tells them, that he had lived at Melrose Avenue previously and that the rest of his victims were killed and disposed of there. And really, he disposed of them quite well. Almost everything that we know about his victims comes from his confession, which of course is why it's so incomplete. I mean, 5 people could never be identified. He seems to remember all of the murders, but he's just not really clear on everybody's name. He had ways of describing them that didn't involve knowing actually who they were, which really says a lot about him as a person. He just really doesn't care. I mean, I feel like that goes without saying because he's a serial killer. He cares more about how they made him feel, how he felt when he was with them, who they were. is just literally a detail that's not at all important to him. And of course, all of the descriptions that he has for them are kind of vague. Again, because it just really didn't matter to him. They were able to find some like bits of bone and stuff like that out in the yard at Melrose Avenue, but there was nothing substantial enough that they could make any kind of identification. They couldn't even determine a cause or manner of death. They're relying solely on what Des Nilsen was telling them. Also during his confession, he tells police that he had attempted to kill 7 other men that ended up getting away or that he let go. He could only remember 4 of their names though. And during this entire interrogation, this whole interview, he just speaks very matter-of-factly without any kind of real emotion or remorse, just like killing people is the most common and normal thing to do. There's just really no feeling behind it whatsoever. But he did seem to go like out of his way to make the investigators' jobs easier. As a matter of fact, when he was waiting to go to trial, he was being housed at Brixton Prison, and he filled up 50 notebooks with all the details of the victims and everything that he could remember about the crimes that he had been committing for the last 5 years. All of these notebooks, all 50 of them, went directly to the prosecution, who was putting him on trial and going to put him in jail. He really just seemed to have no desire for like self-preservation at all. According to investigators, he would later begin to refer to the day he was arrested as the day that help came. I do think that gives some kind of insight into how he viewed what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He wanted to stop, and it was kind of a compulsion. And in its own kind of weird way, that is its own kind of remorse. I don't think he's a person capable of having real remorse. And I do think that it's a selfish kind of remorse because it's still all about him. Even though he's getting in trouble, it's still about making him stop because he's unhappy with the way things are going. It doesn't really have anything to do with the victims at all, but I suppose it's better than trying to evade and get away with it. I don't know. Tell me what you think about that in the comments, because I'd be really interested to know. In the end, he was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. I guess that's all they really had evidence for. Like I said, the remains that they found were mostly unidentifiable in small amounts and definitely couldn't find a cause of death, so 6 is probably about the best that they could do, and even that was probably a little bit ambitious. I'm sure that the fact that they had a full detailed confession probably gave them a lot of confidence. Despite the fact that he wanted to be so helpful to the prosecutors, when he did eventually go to trial on October 24th of 1983, he did end up pleading not guilty. Weird, right? But he was pleading not guilty on the basis of something they call diminished responsibility due to mental defect. I don't know if this is an argument that's still used. I don't think that diminished responsibility is an official thing that we do here in the United States. We have like not guilty by reason of insanity, but basically what it means is that yes, he committed the crimes, but he's not really legally responsible for it because he's so mentally defective that he didn't know what he was doing, more or less. That's my understanding of it. And to back this up, during the trial, the defense brought in 2 different psychologists to talk about all the mental disorders they thought that Des Nilsen had, and to tell about his childhood and how that just sort of impaired his ability to tell right from wrong, and most importantly, made him completely incapable of premeditating these crimes, which, since you're a true crime fan, you probably know that premeditation is necessary to prove murder, right? That's one of the differences between murder and manslaughter, is that you thought ahead of time and planned the crime and then did it. Without the premeditation, there can be no murder. So that's kind of what they're trying to prove here. Of course, the prosecution brought in their own mental health expert who said that even though Des Nilsen is like weird and probably a little messed up. He does know right from wrong, and he was, in fact, capable of pre-planning these murders. Basically, that he was sane from a legal perspective. From a layman's perspective, he's completely wackadoo, of course, but that's not the same thing as legally sane. In the end, though, the judge kind of thought that all of the technical psychiatric jargon was like confusing for the jury, and he summed it up for the jury with these words, which are, in my opinion, so poetic. He said to them, "A mind can be evil without being abnormal." Also presented by the prosecution were photos of the crime scenes, the cutting board that Nilsen used to dissect some parts of the bodies, the large stock pot he used to boil skulls, hands, and feet, which, by the way, is now at the Black Museum at Scotland Yard. I would love to go there someday. If I had a bucket list, that would be on it. They also presented all of the interview notes from their confession and interrogation with Nilsen, like read them to the jury word for word. It took 4 hours. I don't know about you, but I could not have concentrated that long. I don't envy that jury. I don't think I could have done it. They'd had to bring in an alternate. I would just be up there dissociating. The prosecution also brought in 3 known survivors: Paul Nobbs, Douglas Stewart, and, of course, our friend Carl Stoddart. Douglas Stewart had actually reported to police when Dennis Nilsen had tried to strangle him and he was able to get away. The police did come to Nilsen's house and question him about it, and then ultimately decided that it was just a lover's quarrel and nothing was done about it. There's that homophobia. Paul Nobbs was a university student and he had voluntarily stayed the night with Nilsen, but when he woke up in the morning, it was like the wee hours of the morning, and he was really disoriented. He went to wash his face and noticed that his eyes were really badly bloodshot and his face was bright red. He had a splitting headache. All of these things, of course, are consistent with somebody trying to strangle you. But Paul did not ever report this to the police because he was afraid of being outed. Now, even with all of this evidence, the confession, and 3 eyewitness testimonies from survivors, the jury could not come to a unanimous decision on his guilt. Or rather, I should say that they knew he was actually guilty, but they couldn't come to a decision as to whether he was legally responsible. They still were playing out this mental defect thing. But the judge did decide to accept a majority verdict. That's not a thing here. I'm not familiar with this idea. Like here, it's all or nothing. Either the jury agrees or they don't, and it's a hung jury, and it has to go to trial again and get a whole new trial with a whole new jury. There's no majority verdict. So I'm very interested in this. Seems like it could be a good way to go, but we don't do it here. But the judge did accept the majority verdict, and Dennis was found guilty of all 6 murder charges and then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Why not ever? Like, why would he ever be eligible for parole? This is crazy to me. So basically what this meant was he gets life in prison, but after serving 25 years, he's eligible to be paroled. I feel like this is not good, right? Like, this is not the way to go. He killed like 15 people. Anyway, it doesn't really matter because Dennis Nilsen never was paroled. And in 2018, when he was 72 years old, he suffered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, which led to his death. Basically, it caused a pulmonary embolism, which for those of us who are not doctors is kind of when the blood vessels in your body go. It's very excruciatingly painful, and Dennis managed to hang on for 2 whole days before the rupture finally ended his life. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And that is all I've got for you today about Dennis Nilsen. Man, what a story. He is one of the UK's most prolific serial killers, and it's really surprising that he's not more well-known. Maybe he's really well-known in the UK. I mean, this guy had a very high body count with some really really disturbing circumstances surrounding his murders. I hope that you found this story as interesting as I did. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and give a thumbs up on this video if you liked it. Do something to take care of yourself today. Drink a glass of water or something. You know you're dehydrated. I will see you again very soon with a whole new episode. And until then, bye.